time. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the Peace Bills launch event of the Mass Network for Peace and Justice. The Mass Network for Peace and Justice is a coalition of peace groups in Massachusetts, peace and justice groups that have prepared a suite of 7 bills in the state legislature. And we're going to learn about those bills today, learn about the state legislature, and figure out what we can do to take action to pass these bills. The session is being recorded. The day will have, it's not the day, it's just a 2-hour event, but the event will have 3 parts. First, we have couple of great activists that are going to explain to us what's going on in the state legislature with progressive issues generally, and how peace bills fit in, and what we can expect, and some hints on how we can best advocate. Second is we're going to learn about the bills themselves, and we're going to hear from 7 state legislators who have each filed one of the bills, and they're going to explain the bills to us and why they're important. And last but not least, we're going to break into breakouts on a regional basis to plan the work to actually advance and pass these bills. So that's the plan, and I'm going to turn it over to Amar to get us started. Amar, take it away.
Great, thank you, Cole. Yeah, so the activists at Mass Peace Action and elsewhere, we work so hard to try to get our elected officials in Congress and in the State House to implement policies of peace. We lobby for these peace bills, we arrange meetings, we arrange rallies. In fact, just later today, there's a rally happening, I believe, at Fresh Pond in Cambridge. One of our members, Paul Shannon, is a part of where they're trying to call attention to this war in Yemen, which is happening. And Saudi Arabia is imposing a war on Yemen with the support of, the US is greenlighting Saudi Arabia and allowing them to impose this war on Yemen. So the point I'm making is that at Mass Peace Action, we believe in engaging all levels of government to implement policies of peace. And today we're gathered to talk about the Massachusetts State House. Our activists, again, they work so hard to try to implement policies of peace. The war in Yemen I mentioned earlier, there's a state bill we'll learn about today addressing it, where we're asking the state pension to divest from companies that make weapons that are profiting off of the war in Yemen. And we have a host of other bills that we'll be talking about today as well. So to get us started, to kick off this event today, we're going to be hearing from Martha Durkee Neumann, who is from Mass Alliance, and Jonathan Cohn, who is from Progressive Mass. Both of these individuals and the organizations they come from, they work very closely with the state legislature, and they're very important grassroots organizers. So we look forward to hearing from them and seeing what they have to say about the State House. So I'll pass the floor over to Martha and then Jonathan in a second. Cole, I think both Martha and Jonathan have slides they'd like to show. Could we make them
okay, we'll do. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so great. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor here to, there's Jonathan, and let me find Martha.
I'm here, Amar.
Okay, yeah, so I think you'll have to put your video on for me to spotlight you here.
Yep, I'm speaking so my box will light up.
There you go. Thanks, Martha.
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome.
So yeah, so you guys are co-hosts now. I don't know which one of you wants to go first or how you guys are doing the slideshow. So
Martha, I'm happy for you to go first. Mine are like first in the slideshow. I'm happy to go first. I'm fine either way.
Do you want to kick it off, Jonathan?
Okay, I'll start. And thank you also. Name's Jonathan Cohn. I chair the Issues Committee with Progressive Massachusetts. Want to thank Mass Peace Action for hosting this and for all of the great work that all of you on this call and all of the people watching do. And also shout out to my co-panelist here, Martha, who's kind of an amazing person. It's always a pleasure to be able to work with. So in 1 second, I'm going to share slides. I put together a few things slides to talk about kind of what the situation is with the Massachusetts State House, what to expect in the coming months, what are some of the structural barriers that activists face, and what are some of the things that you can do to help change that. And let me formally start that now. Let's see, which is the okay. Okay. Let me do a screen share. Okay. Does this show up properly now?
Yes, looking good.
Okay, great. So just titled it, "What's the Matter with Massachusetts? It's a State House." For this owning thing, and with a photo that I really like of sunlight over the golden dome of the State House. It's a nice piece of nice kind of stock photo that I found. Okay, so kind of an opening on that point. So Massachusetts has the third largest Democratic supermajorities in the country in terms of our state legislature. We're only beaten by Hawaii and Rhode Island. I think recently Hawaii had no Republicans in their state legislature. I don't know if that's still the same, but that was overwhelmingly Democratic. Rhode Island, I think depending on how you calculate, we might beat Rhode Island, but I believe that they're slightly higher. And yet, despite that fact, you often see you don't have the same sense of felt urgency around a number of crises that you might expect to see in a state like that. You see often a deference to Republican governors that we elect. It's nice to see that starting to change on some issues, and I'll shout out the recent climate bill as an example that where rather than backing down and accepting everything that the governor asked for, the legislature did decide to stick to their original positions and move forward. But there's often a sense of, if the governor doesn't support it, why should we even bother? Which has a kind of a major impact on limiting ambitions, as well as there's often kind of a conservative conventional wisdom in Massachusetts, despite being a deep blue state. And one way I often describe that is that we were often haunted by the ghosts of failed bills and ballot initiatives passed. That you can often see in different areas of that things stayed, kind of temper ambitions, as well as I often describe a kind of a certain person who believes in progress but wants nothing to change as being kind of a kind of political complacency that comes from being in a state that people think has already accomplished everything by our being so deep blue, when we know that's not the case, right? We know that during the 4 years of the Trump administration, Massachusetts didn't pass any new laws to protect the rights of immigrants. We know that our work on climate is years late and less ambition than need be. We know we need to be investing more in our schools and our public transit and our public health infrastructure, and that there's a lot of work to do. One thing that always comes to mind when talking about legislators is this study from 2013 by two academics, and they looked at state legislators around the country, and they found that there was a systematic bias from both conservative and liberal legislators on the state level. There's a noted that conservative state legislators often overestimated how conservative their constituents were by about 20%. And even liberal politicians also overestimated their constituents' conservatism. And one of the goals of activism is to change that fact, right? If you have this built-in bias, and then how do you move the needle to change their perception so that you move that constituency and you move how they view that constituency? One thing that also often comes to mind is how, despite the fact that many legislators will talk about how conservative their districts are, that you have, like in 2016, Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump in all but 3 Senate districts and all but 20 House districts. It was similar for like the 2018 Senate race. Joe Biden probably beat Donald Trump in even more than that. And so most people's districts, even though they may be complacent, they're not districts that voted for Donald Trump presidentially. So that gives it, like, not that, let's say, Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden is like a major progressive champion or anything, but it shows that space for movement. It shows that there are things that they could be doing more than what we are, and that we should take advantage of the conditions here to be an ambitious and an agenda-setting state. Okay. One thing, as I talk about the legislature itself, one quote that always comes to mind is the quote that every system is perfectly designed to produce the results that it gets. Back in 2014, Don Berwick used this a lot in his gubernatorial campaign. And it's something that I keep in mind, because although that there's so much important external pressure to be put on the State House, it also raises the question of how does the State House itself operate, and how can we change the way that it operates to better enable the work that we do on the outside? One of the central problems of the State House that I like to say is that there's a 2 bosses problem in the Massachusetts State House, right? So that you have, for in most jobs that you might have, the person who can hire and fire you and the person who decides your pay are the same person. Whereas in the legislature, your constituents decide whether or not to hire or fire you every election, and House or Senate or leadership decide your pay. And with the different committee chairmanships or vice chairmanships and the stipends that come with them. And so that creates a kind of a weird dynamic where you want to be able to do what your constituents are asking you to do, but there's an incentive structure to also do what those who are in higher rank than you and determine your pay want you to do. Not even to mention the other kind of nexus in all of this about like major campaign donors being another potential boss. But this is a kind of a consistent source of tension, and the goal of activism, again, is to assert that prior boss and the importance of the people who are your constituents and who are the ones who decide whether or not you get to keep your job. And for a Passover theme, like the holiday that starts tonight, that I would put in something that I mean, if we're talking about the 4 different children of the Massachusetts legislature and the questions that each one of them tends to ask. That you tend to have those that are good, those who would be better with better incentives, those who create bad incentives for others, and those who are only there to cut ribbons. That the ones who are good are the ones who are asking what needs to be done and how can I help? The ones who would be better with better incentives are the ones who ask what needs to be done and is it worth the risk? The child who creates bad incentives for others asks why the urgency? And the ones who are only there to cut ribbons don't ask questions because they're only there to cut ribbons. And our role is to both help empower that first group, to help create the incentives for that second group so that they see that it's worth taking the risks, to help push back against those who are creating bad incentives, and to help kind of spur those who feel a sense of complacency to feel a greater sense of urgency. So where are we right now? That at the start of the legislative session, from January to February, you had more than 4,100 bills filed in the House and more than 2,500 in the Senate. I think those numbers are right. I tried to figure out the highest number I could find for a docket number in both of those. And kudos to Mass Peace Action for doing the work of getting kind of co-sponsors to file bills and narrowing it down to some kind of core bills to fight on. Of that massive number of bills filed, only about 10% of them will ever become law, and most of them are some of the most minor of that 10%, like maybe like an additional liquor license for a town type of bill, or something very small, rather than the more kind of ambitious and agenda-setting bills. And one thing that's important to know as we move forward in advocating for these bills is that your legislators can sign on at any time. That's also a welcome new change, that for people's ability to sign on to House bills at any time, but that's an important thing to do. So you have that continual step of getting them to step 1 of co-sponsoring a bill at any time during the session. And it's important to remember that that is just one step of kind of a ladder of engagement for a legislator of actions that they could take. Okay, I also want, when talking about the way that the legislature operates, currently, although committees will now finally start operating so that we can get to hearings and the bills forward, we actually don't have joint rules for how the chamber operates. So how those committees function, they exist now as of this week, but because the House and Senate haven't come to an agreement on what the joint rules should look like, there are still things at stake. And I just wanted to shout out a few of the kind of things of contention there that the Senate has been advocating for to help make a more open process of publishing the votes taken in committee online, as a majority of states do, of treating testimony as a public record with the appropriate redactions that any public records have for privacy and other concerns, and giving greater advance notice for hearings so that you won't be surprised just a few days before the hearing on your bill and have to scramble into action. None of such changes is going to be a panacea, but they all help to open up the process and create greater tools for accountability and to be able to identify and empower supporters and to convert the undecided or the opponents into supporters and figure out who's actually on the other side. I'll go through this quickly, and like Martha, if I'm cutting into your time, just make a face so I'll see it. So we're in the legislative process. As is mentioned, it started a little bit late this year, but in January and February was when bills were getting filed. Since committees now joint committees now exist, soon those bills will be assigned to committees and given the formal numbers for the session. That 2019 is a holdover, it should say 2021, because I adapted an old slide. So we're not going back in time, but in the spring, summer, fall, maybe into the winter, hearings will be held on the bill, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. And then at some point, committees will vote, and they do have a technical deadline of February of next year to take action, and those bills can be rewritten, and so it's important to keep an eye out for what's happening at every stage. So what that committee does, it either will kind of advance that bill to a next committee, it'll vote it down and it's dead for the session, or it'll send a study order. An important bit of legislative terminology, those studies never happen. It's just a polite way of dispensing with the bill for the session. And the goal is to get that first step of making sure that first committee that your bill gets to can get out of there and on typically the Ways and Means is where it goes next. And I'll kind of skip through this because it's just a lot of process, but goal is to getting it out of that first committee, getting it out of Ways and Means, and then getting it onto a vote on the floor. And then dealing with our governor after it, which this is my many diagram, right? What happens there that I will take long and I won't go into every little bit of it, but it shows the different steps that can happen. But that getting it out of that first committee is the important step for the upcoming months. And probably the biggest thing here is we just need a better governor. But how to take action is, as I noted before, hearings will be happening in this maybe the late spring, summer, and fall, and showing up for hearings, whether they're still virtual or whether they're in person, is a way of showing that there's a constituency behind these bills and a sense of urgency, and it kind of shapes the perception of legislators about what they think is important. Lobbying your legislators, they represent you and they need to hear from you, and then every kind of step of what you can do is important, in the way that a phone call is more impactful than an email. Showing up has even more impact than a phone call, and showing up with multiple people is even more valuable than showing up just by yourself, in terms of how to help convince your legislators that this is important to their community and that they need to take action. And you can also ask legislators to do a different steps of activity. Co-sponsoring a bill is just step one. You can ask them to help lobby their colleagues on the bill. You can ask them to help speak at events about the bill, or write op-eds about the bill, or send letters to House or Senate leadership or committee chairs about the bill to testify at that hearing. Because each step is, because the goal is to convert all of them from being passive supporters to being active champions of legislation. Two sources of power that you have in that, and Martha will talk about the second one, is media and elections. So one thing that I often encourage people to think about think of the power that you as a constituent have. One is the press. You can give good press and you can give bad press, because that's something that you can determine. And so you can give positive reinforcing press by having people write complimentary things in the local news, or you can talk about why they need to step up their game in the local news or in letters, and that helps speak to other constituents. It helps engage more people and helps shape the perception of what the community thinks. And if your legislators are if you feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall for them, you can vote them out as another source of power. And I'll let Martha go into that more when it's her turn. I won't go into this because this is too long, but I do have a list of frequently heard excuses. The website is down at the bottom, which I hope is not cut off by like the screen sharing thing here. But legislators are very creative people, but they're often not creative about the excuses that they give you for why they won't sign on to bills. So I did compile a list of the most commonly heard excuses. If we have time Q&A, happy to go into that. I love this graphic of the excuses. And then some key takeaways that I wanted to hit before passing it on to Martha is I like to say that 90% of politics is just showing up, really at any stage. And like the next 10% is probably showing up the other times. That's what helps change. That's what helps change perception. It's what creates momentum. It's what builds pressure, and what increases engagement. I've always asked for receipts, that you want your legislators to take action, and you want to know that they actually did that. So make sure to get kind of that evidence of the follow through when you engage. That you never have to vote to change the culture. So the legislature, to have a more democratic, kind of in bolder legislature is something that you can engage on throughout the session of trying to embolden legislators. It's not something that they need to take a formal vote on to suddenly kind of have higher ambition. And you probably know more than your legislators about a lot already. So when you advocate for bills, don't feel like you need to be an expert on every little tiny detail. Your legislators probably aren't either. And so their goal is to listen to their constituents and to take action and to learn more if they don't know the stuff already. And so know that your values and the knowledge that you already bring by being engaged is what matters and what they need to listen to. And I think that's my set of slides. Martha, you can screen share, or I can just move it along for you on my screen.
If you want to keep clicking through, that would be great.
Okay, can do.
Thanks, Jen. Good morning, Mass Peace Action folks. My name is Martha J. Neumann. I'm the campaigns and fundraising organizer here at Mass Alliance. Thank you so much for having us this morning. And thank you, John, for your amazing opening remarks. I really appreciated it. A lot of what I have to say builds on what John had to say, and we work really closely together. What I will start out with is these are kind of two prongs of the same approach that we in the progressive movement have of changing the culture in the building and electing good people who are going to fight for the things that we care about. All right, go ahead, Jen. So what I'm going to talk about is the need for progressive electoral movement building for the Commonwealth. John said 90% of politics is showing up. There are multiple ways to do that, right? We're all here together on a Saturday morning. This is one way to show up. Another is considering a run for office or supporting a local candidate in your area. A lot of the structural things that John talked about are really, really important, right? We want to change some of these transparency things. We want to work on passing really good progressive legislation. And at Mass Alliance, one thing that we also talk about is the need for having progressive champions in the building. They're going to fight for some of these legislative victories and goals that we have as a shared progressive movement. And peace is such an important part of that. I will say also, I work now for Mass Alliance, but I got my start in organizing in the peace movement. The first professional job I ever had in organizing was in the peace movement. So these issues are really near and dear to my heart. So there are many, many ways to make change, including advocating for the bills that y'all are here to do, and running for office is one of those pieces. Go ahead, Jen. There they are. This is the Senate. So one of the things that we look at when we look at the Senate and the House, I didn't want to get all their pictures on here because they would be too small, is whether or not you can see yourself reflected and represented in our legislative body. 90% of the Senate is Democratic and 80% of the House. As John said, we have the third largest supermajority in the country most of the time, and yet progressive legislation stalls all the time. It is really hard for us to pass good progressive bills, even though 90% of our senators are Democrats and 80% of our House members are Democrats. I have a couple of other quick stats here. 35% of senators have been in office for over 10 years, and 13% have been in office for over 20 years. In the House, it's very, very similar. 38% have been in office for over 10 years, and the same 13% have been in office for over 20 years. Go ahead. Who is not in the building? Only 9% of both members in the chambers are people of color. Women make up less than 30% of legislative seats and only a quarter of leadership positions and committee chairs. And only 8% of the Senate and 5% of the House are openly LGBTQ people. So a lot of the population of Massachusetts is not represented in our legislature. Go ahead, John. So one of the ways that we make change is changing who is in positions of power. In the House, it takes 16 members, which is 10% of the House, to call for a roll call vote. As we know, most of the bills pass without us knowing who voted in which way, which makes legislative advocacy and lobbying and holding our elected officials really hard. So having a good contingent of folks who are able to call for a roll call vote is one of our ways of changing the power. We also work on building up progressive support between colleagues in the building. Our legislators feel more comfortable taking those risks when they have each other's backs, when they know that they have community and fellowship. The culture in the House often tries to silo reps alone so that they feel like the actions that they're taking are alone and that they have to fight for their constituents on their own. And one of the things that we really care about is building up that progressive support between colleagues. Go ahead, Jen. Our elected officials are accountable to us. At the end of the day, we have this two bosses problem in the Massachusetts State House, but our legislators are elected by the voters. And so if we're not liking what they're doing, we can run against them and we can vote them out. Progressive challenger campaigns are good for democracy. They're good for our local communities, and they're good for pushing through progressive legislation. An example, folks are familiar with Jordan Meehan, who ran against Kevin Honan in Alston and Brighton last year, 2018, sorry, 2020. I have no conception of time anymore in the pandemic. Jordan Meehan is a young progressive activist. Kevin Honan was at the time the chair of the Housing Committee, and the moratorium on rent evictions was really stuck in that committee. Jordan Meehan ran a powerful challenger campaign, did not win, but still, as you can tell in the date of this news story, that bill moved out of committee just a month after the primary. So our progressive challenger campaigns, hopefully we want to win our campaigns, but even if we don't, it still has power to push on a progressive legislation. Go ahead, John. So John covered this already, but most American politicians believe that their constituents are more conservative than they are. This is true for Massachusetts. You can go ahead one more. Yep, this is from that same article. I can link this afterwards. Go ahead one more, John. This is true for Massachusetts. So this is a map of Yes on 3, the ballot initiative campaign in 2018 about the rights and protections of our transgender friends and neighbors in Massachusetts, which almost overwhelmingly passed in almost every district in Massachusetts. The rights of transgender Americans is a really, really important issue and a very progressive one. And we had an amazing ground game for the Yes on 3 campaign, but also a lot of legislators assumed that their constituents were not going to support this ballot question, and people overwhelmingly supported it. So this is just an example of why legislators assuming their constituents are more conservative than they are is true for Massachusetts. Go ahead, John. All right, and we're getting to the end of our time. So what I will tell you is that grassroots campaigns are winning campaigns. We can and do run and win people-centered campaigns, legislative and grassroots campaigns. There are more of us than there are of them. We know this to be true. There are more young people, people of color, LGBTQ Americans, women, the groups that kind of our progressive movement is centered around. There are more of us than there are of our opponents. It's a matter of mobilizing our people and putting the right kind of pressure pressure on the right stakeholders. If you are interested in running for office, if you are interested in working with a candidate in your area, if you are interested in running a ballot initiative campaign, a legislative campaign, training somebody to run for office, please get in touch with me. I'll put my email in the chat. Mass Alliance runs a full campaigns training program. And if you think that your representative or the person who represents you in your district has consistently voted against progressive legislation, we want to know. And we want to know if you have somebody in your area that you're thinking about running. And my last slide, Jonathan. Organizing is about all of us this is like my favorite organizing graphic of all time. We cannot take on a shark as little fish all swimming around. But when we organize, when we get ourselves together, when we put ourselves in line, there is no problem that is too big for us to tackle together. There are more of us than there are of them. And this is our power when we join together and make change together, which is why I'm so excited that all of y'all are here today to kind of do the work of doing some of this legislative organizing and move forward on your issues. All right. We're about at time, but if we have like maybe one more minute, Cohn and Amar, can we take questions for maybe 1 minute, and then we'll cede the floor to some of our amazing legislators.
Yeah, sure. Let's take one question, and then we'll move along with the schedule just to stay on task. So if anybody has a question, why don't they could use their raise hand feature in Zoom. Okay, I see a question from Mary Ellen. So I'll pass the floor to Mary Ellen.
Yeah, hi, and thanks for your presentations. As you were going over, you know, how the representatives and senators are reflected, I didn't see any information about like wealth disparities or class issues, and I was wondering if you have any information about that. Because, for example, with the transgender referendum, that didn't necessarily butt up against, you know, business interests straight up, but I know that other stuff has in the past, certainly like the bottle bill, and I can't think of, but there, and the nurses issues stuff as well. So do you have any information about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have any data about classism in the State House, but we know exactly how power and money are linked and how they move in our legislators' minds and pockets. So that's data I would love to have. It's a little bit harder to find than some of the kind of other distinctions that we've been looking at. But I think you're absolutely right that a lot of times the class differentials that we have in our state are not reflected in our legislature, that we know, at seeing a lot of our like anti-poverty measures fail in the State House. So it's data I would love to get access to. But I think that you're absolutely right about a lot of the bills that we're looking at when there are strong economic implications. We have a corporate lobby with a lot of power that fights against our progressive values.
And there's even a really good, this doesn't get into the representation element of that, but in terms of the impact on policy, I can link it in the chat. There was a good report recently coming out of Brown where there were kind of some students there had looked at the impact of money around climate policy, of looking to see who was lobbying and who was who was testifying, and how often those who were kind of the moneyed interest lobbying behind closed doors were able to have outsized impact. And I can link that into the chat because there's a lot of really interesting data. And it also just speaks to your point of how it's expensive to run for office, which is one of, and like addressing those barriers is one thing you can do. I know that there's legislation to make it so that parents are able to expense childcare to their campaign account, because childcare is a very expensive thing in the state. And you have to kind of like stop working and then still afford all of that in order to run. That becomes prohibitive. And so it kind of just speaks to the need to change how campaigns are funded and how campaigns are operated to make it so that people who are to make sure that working class people can run for office.
We also had a clean elections bill that was passed years ago and then never funded. So we do have infrastructure in our state for doing campaign finance reform, and there aren't dollars behind it. So that's a change that I would love to see that would permit more folks from diverse backgrounds to run for office, especially diverse class backgrounds.
All right. Well, thank you, Martha and Jonathan, and thank you, Mary Ellen, for that question. You know, I had no idea that you guys were going to make slideshow presentations, so thank you so much for the effort you put in to present that information to us. I'm seeing people are messaging me in the chat saying like how valuable they found that information. So thank you guys so much. All right, so moving right along to stay on track with our program agenda. Next up, I want to pass the floor to Paul Shannon, a very committed activist and important member of Mass Peace Action. So Paul, take it away, please.
Okay, thank you, Amar, and good morning, everyone. We especially want to thank, in addition to Martha and John, of course, the senators and representatives that have joined us this morning and taken time out of your busy schedules to do so. And we're really looking forward to hearing from you. I see that a number of the representatives and senators that are listed here to make presentations are already on the call, and so let's move right along. Our first presenter will be Representative Jay Livingstone, who will be talking about the, well, let me just say that Jay is the representative from the 8th Suffolk District, made up mainly of Boston, but also parts of Cambridge. And Jay will be talking about the moral budget for Massachusetts, which in the House is HD 2617, and it's also been filed in the Senate as Senate 2247. So Jay, welcome, and thanks for being with us this morning.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning to everyone else. Thanks for your participation. It's always exciting to see so many people wanting to spend a Saturday learning about progressive politics. It was interesting to hear Martha and John talk about their view of the State House. And it's one thing I will add is one of the things that John said is how important it is to have a good governor. And that was seen this last term. One of my biggest victories this last term was getting reproductive rights bill across the finish line. I was told we needed to get 106 votes, assuming a Baker veto. We got 108 votes. That is now law, and it was 108 votes over Baker's veto. Other bills didn't have that. If we had a Democratic governor, that lowers it to 80, and you don't need a lot of the very moderate members that would vote with you to pass progressive legislation. And so he was spot on about needing a much better governor. But that's not why I came here today. I came here today to talk about a bill that I'm partnering with Mass Peace Action on called an act to establish a commission to report on a moral budget. And this is a bill filed before last term. It received a favorable report out of the Veteran Services Committee and went to Ways and Means right about the time the pandemic was hitting and really got jammed up there. So this term, I think we're hopefully going to get it across the finish line. And I'm excited to work on it. And I'm excited to work with Mass Peace Action. It was a great organization and works incredibly hard on all the right priorities. So what does the bill do? And the bill does two basic things. So first, we changed the name this term. Before it was the People's Budget, and now it's a moral budget. And the reason we did that was to align this bill with the Poor People's Campaign for where they're pushing the moral budget. And they've agreed to support our campaign. And I think it's very important for progressives to work hand in hand together to increase their capacity and move legislation. And so the Poor People's Moral Budget is a great document, and it is. And so the first thing the bill does is it is a statement of the Massachusetts Legislature to encourage our federal officials to support the moral budget. And the moral budget, basically, we want to spend less on the military. The United States spends a ridiculous amount on military and more on the social safety net. We want to put, it invests $24.4 billion in K-12, $70 billion for free public college, $44 billion for housing. There's still a housing crisis in Massachusetts and across the country. it makes important statements regarding climate protection, increases the minimum wage to $15, and makes important statements to end our foreign incursions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. And so that statement of a moral budget is the first thing it does, is those are the things that we want, and those are the things that are going to make the biggest difference. And especially in the context of the last year, you know, our social safety net has never been strong enough to reach everyone that's needed help. But the last year really showed some of the core weaknesses in the social safety net. And I think there's more acknowledgement of some of those issues. And I think it's time for the Massachusetts State House to make the statement with the federal budget of what we expect. So that's the first thing it does. The second thing it does is it creates a commission to report on what it would look like for Massachusetts if the moral budget passed. What a difference it would make with respect to education, with respect to housing, with respect to the social safety net. And you know, there's a 15-member commission that would do this work, and they would annually issue a report. And and that's important, and it goes consistent with some of the things that Jonathan and Martha talked about. You know, for Massachusetts, the budget is pretty transparent. You can go to mass.gov, you can look up very specific line items. It's a smaller budget than the federal budget, and you can see specifically where Massachusetts is spending its dollars. And almost the entire budget is going towards the social safety net. The federal budget isn't as transparent, isn't as accessible, and nowhere does it show exactly the level of detail that the poor people's budget is demanding. Also, people don't appreciate how much the Massachusetts budget relies on federal dollars. You know, at the beginning of last year, at various points, we thought the budget was going to be down up to $7 billion. It ended up not being close to that. And there was talk, some people assumed that there was talk of cuts to the social safety net. The budget we passed for this current fiscal year ended up being $3 billion more than what was proposed by the governor in January before the pandemic. That's a huge number. The total budget was $46 billion. And it's, but that level of transparency, but by way of comparison, for the $7 billion shortfall, the Trump was talking about ending the Affordable Care Act. If the Affordable Care Act was ended, Massachusetts would have lost somewhere on the order of $15 to $20 billion in federal funding. Just a huge number that would have been a more significant hole than the pandemic would have caused. And I don't think people understand that significance and that how significant the federal dollars are to the Massachusetts budget, how much of the Massachusetts budget has exponentially grown because of those federal dollars, and particularly with respect to the medical safety net. And so this report would more accurately show that to people, but not only that, but show the enhancements to the social safety net that would come from the federal government adopting the poor people's budget. And I think that that sunshine, that transparency, showing people what is possible is important, and so that's what we're trying to do with this bill. And I hope you'll join us in supporting it. I'm really looking forward to working again with Mass Peace Action. Cole and Jonathan and Paul and Lori Tamer Berry have all been fantastic. to work with, and hopefully get it over the finish line. And together, we can do that. So, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jay, and thanks for all your help over the years with these bills. Let's hope we can get them further along this year. Appreciate all the energy that you put into this. Our next presenter will be Representative Carol Doherty. Representative Doherty represents the 3rd Bristol District, which includes big chunks of the towns of Easton and Taunton, so from a very different part of the state. And Representative Doherty will be talking about the taxpayer's right to know, which is House Docket 1446 at this stage. And maybe, I don't know, Carol, whether you can tell us what the outlook is in terms of when these bills will be assigned to committees as well. So thank you for being with us this morning.
Yes, well, you're entirely welcome, and thank you very much for inviting me. I have been out of the activity of the Peace Action agenda now for a number of years, and so I'm very pleased to be invited to step back in sponsoring HD 1446. My introduction to the peace agenda had been the Jobs with Peace campaign, and so I decided I'd Google Jobs with Peace to see if there's any mention somewhere out there in the great web to talk about the Jobs with Peace campaign, and indeed there is. I know that there was a box of material from the old Jobs with Peace campaign that was uncovered, and posted on a particular website was a document that was crafted in 1982, actually, titled "The Effects of Military Spending on Education and the Economy in Massachusetts." And it was crafted between the Jobs with Peace campaign, Jonathan King, I have to say, that's how I met Jonathan, and the Massachusetts Teachers Association. And of no surprise is that the agenda back then was basically a similar, if not the same agenda as there is today. So I have to congratulate all of you who have been laboring in the vineyard for so many decades on an agenda that's really critical and important to not only the people in Massachusetts, but the people across the country, and if not the world. So House HD 1446 is an act providing federal and state budget information to residents of the Commonwealth. I'm going to read the description. The bill directs the state treasurer, in coordination with the Secretary of State, to send residents of Massachusetts annual reports detailing the total amount of income tax paid to the state and federal governments and what that money is used for. That's the key, what that money is used for. The purpose of this bill is to increase transparency and educate the residents of Massachusetts as to how their tax dollars are being spent. And I had to take note that back then in 1982, 61% of the federal budget was spent on military spending. And I found another piece of data from 2015. I couldn't find anything more current, but nonetheless, 54% of the federal budget was spent on military spending at that time. And we know, of course, that the federal budget has grown enormously over those years. So I'm very pleased to sponsor this bill. And for those of you who are activists and my colleagues who are legislators as well, co-sponsoring this bill would really be very welcome by Mass Peace Action and by myself. So your question, Paul, about the legislative process, this bill has not yet, as was pointed out by Jonathan, actually, the bills have not yet been assigned, or they're perhaps slowly trickling out to the committees to be in those assignments. So we'll know where these bills will end up and start legislating around them, as has been pointed out by Jonathan. So that's pretty much where we are. I'm a new legislator, as you may know, and so everything is always a revelation to me as we go forward. So thank you very much. We have a Veterans Remembrance Day today, so I am going to leave the call. I hate to do that because I'm interested in hearing what my colleagues and others have to say, but nonetheless, so I can go down and meet the veterans and say a few words to them in recognition of their service to this country. So thank you. Thanks, Mass Peace Action, and my friend Jonathan there as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Representative Doherty, and thanks very much for bringing these bills to the attention of the Progressive Caucus. especially appreciate that. Our next presenter will be Nika Eligardo. Happy to say that Representative Eligardo is representing the 15th Suffolk District, which includes a big chunk of Boston, but also a little sliver of Brookline. And Nika is going to be speaking about the Yemen divestment bill, which is a very timely bill right now, given big decisions being made in Washington, D.C. about whether we will continue in Yemen supporting the Saudis. So this is House docket number 3348. And Nika, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Yes, thank you for having me. I have put some links that I'll refer to. I'm just dropping the last one in the chat there, which include the link to the bill. Actually, the language of the bill is pretty short, so I won't need to speak long on its contents. An act relative to pension divestment from companies selling weapons to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is that. So we won't be investing after the passage of this bill our retirement funds as state employees into companies like Raytheon that are selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which are being used in their war, so-called war, whatever it is, their unjust attacks and human rights violations in Yemen and other places. So it's pretty straightforward. This year, last year it went to study from the Public Service Committee. It hasn't been assigned to a committee yet, but I'm taking a different strategy this year based on some work that I did with Rep. Sabadosa on the Flag and Seal bill, and some work that I did with Mike Connolly on in housing, and then on one of my, with Chairman Honan on another housing bill that got pretty far, and I think is promising, a public housing bill. And that basically means, instead of the scattershot approach I took last year, which is like get co-sponsor as much as you can, get as many co-sponsors as you can, I really want to make sure that we're very focused at each phase. And so the first phase, where it's being assigned to a committee, I'd like to target our energies at the committee. And you can see, if you click on this link, that we have many friends, even the 5 co-sponsors that we have, some of them are on this committee, right? And so we should really focus on getting it out of the committee and use a lot of energy. I see Mike, I heard that Lindsay was on, you know, Jay's a big supporter. So we could get it out of the committee, I believe that. And then we'll move from there, and I'll be working, talking to the speaker and to Aaron Michaelwitz to see if there are any holdups, but I would like us to focus our energy after it leaves committee on really gaining support in the places that might be swing voters, instead of putting all of our energy, as we've talked about before, messaging to the progressives that already agree with us and will be rapidly at our side to help us out, especially if it comes out of committee. So those are just some thoughts, and I'm happy to take questions. Here's my cell phone if you want to text me. Some of you know that my health's been up and down. It's down at the moment, so I'm sorry that I can't be with you more. But I am on the up and up overall, so not to worry. But it does look like I have a few months out ahead. And so if there's anything, any of my colleagues on here, if I haven't co-sponsored your stuff yet, don't worry, it will all be co-sponsored before we get to the hearing. But I am pacing myself, so thank you all for your patience with that.
Nika, thank you so much, and thank you for taking on this bill. We look forward to working out with you that strategy so that we're all on the same page. Amar, is there a question out there that you might have a second to answer, or can you see anything there?
We'd better keep going, Paul.
Okay, I guess we're a little bit behind. So Nika, we hope you feel better soon.
Thank you.
Sorry you're going through this difficulty.
I know. I'm becoming more humble as a result, so that's always good.
Thanks so much for given what you're dealing with joining us this morning.
Your work is very important to me, not just on this bill, but as you know, Black and Brown communities very often aren't able to or aware of, or for a variety of reasons focused on these global issues that impact us locally and that impact justice so profoundly. And so it's a real gratitude that I bring to you from my communities of all types, that you're holding that space for us. And I'm here with you all the way.
Thanks a million, Nika. We'll move on now. Has Representative Uterhoven joined us?
Yes, she's here.
Oh, great. Great. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce Erica Uterhoven, the state representative for the 27th Middlesex District, which includes big chunks of Somerville. And we're very fortunate that Erica has taken over the seat of our champion, Denise Provo. And so this is terrific news for all of us. And Erica, we want to welcome you this morning and thank you for joining us to talk about the Travel Conflict of Interest Bill, House Docket Bill 1630.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear us? Hear me? Okay, good. All right. Wonderful.
Fine.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you. I'm, as I mentioned, Amar put in the chat, I'm on my way to a tenant organizing canvas. It's very important. We have some of the most egregious landlords in the, I don't know, the state, I suppose, that we need to be organizing around. So I want to make sure we can bring support to tenants across the state. But I just wanted to say thank you. And I want to share a little bit about this bill, which I'm very excited about. It is really to address one of the many ways that we see democracy, unfortunately, at odds, right? Because unfortunately, we have and still do and still continue to have influence of money in politics. And fortunately, we do have some good ethics laws that, people like myself, right, as electeds, I cannot accept more than $50 in terms of gifts from lobbyists, which I think makes a lot of sense. But unfortunately, there is a massive loophole in that law around how, myself or my colleagues can be influenced by money, which is around travel. And so there are these, there's a loophole that enables so that, I can get a free trip to go somewhere to, quote, learn about, for example, Google or Facebook, or I can learn about the gambling industry or Comcast, right? These are all concrete examples of where legislators were given free trips on, generally corporate lobbyist interest mind, as well as folks probably are very familiar with. And I'll say this is something that I was exposed to very early on in my just political journey, which is the trip to Israel. And that's something that I was actually exposed to very early on. People were saying, oh, it's really great. You get this free trip to Israel. And I was like, for what, right? And I think, at what cost? And, for me, it's really important that we don't just let any sort of moneyed interest, but particularly this one with the current, what is increasingly a apartheid and occupation state of Israel, to be giving us free trips to, learn, I don't know what, but, the fact that happened so early on, that happened to me before I even was elected, right? This was just me as an advocate. This was something that came up so early. So this is something that, to me, ensuring that we maintain the integrity of our democratic institutions means we take money out of politics. And that's why I'm very excited to be filing this bill that removes this loophole around travel expenses being covered, or to, for us to get free travel, right, for various reasons. Again, they tend to be reasons that I am personally morally opposed to. But that's, so I'm very excited to be concluding this. I think we need to ensure that we protect our democracy and the influence of money in our democracy. And sadly, I'm very excited about this bill, but this will still be just another step and a long way to go because, just the secret of it, I'll just share a little bit about my background. I co-founded Act en Masse, which was, we fight for a healthy democracy and more accountability, accessibility, and transparency in our state house. And that's necessary and underlies every single issue that we fight for, because behind the lack of transparency, behind the curtains or the closed doors, corporate lobbyists are effectively driving the narrative and driving, we are essentially become a corporate mouthpiece to businesses here in Massachusetts rather than fighting for the interests of the people. And I believe that we can build a state house that is the people's house, right? That is represented by our interests, not by interests of a few wealthy individuals or corporations, or in this case, right, states. So something that's very important, and I think something that we'll be continuing to have to organize around, because it is something that underlies all of our politics, right? Whether that's education, climate, how we spend, how we raise revenue. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, I fought to block a corporate tax break that was put into the unemployment insurance bond bill. So those are just many ways it pops up, right, in terms of who are we serving and whose interests are we actually representing. And so this bill to me is a kind of a step in that right direction, but there's so much more we need to do. And so I'm very grateful for groups like Mass Peace Action that, continue to speak truth to power, right, and continue to fight for justice globally and locally here as well. So I'm happy to take any questions about the bill. And thank you all so much for having me and for organizing this.
Thanks very much, Erica, and thanks so much for your courage in taking on this bill. We really very, very much appreciate it, and we look forward to fighting with you for its passage. And I think just from the representatives who have heard so far this morning, we get a sense of how much work these representatives do for us on so many different issues. So I think we want to express our thanks for that and release you to go to your next assignment here. So thanks very much. We look forward to working on this bill with you. And I guess we are short on time, so we'll move on to Representative Mike Conley. Mike, it's welcome this morning. You don't know it, but we're the only two people probably on the call this morning that grew up in Norwood and now live in the Cambridge, Somerville area. And so welcome this morning. Mike, for many of you know, he represents the 26th Middlesex District, which has a big section of Cambridge and even a couple of wards in Somerville that he represents. And Mike is going to talk to us this morning about the nuclear weapons divestment bill, House Docket Bill 1914. So welcome, Mike. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Good morning, Mass Peace Action. It's an honor to be here with you. It's great to be here with some of our progressive champions in the legislature. I'm here to talk about legislation I filed this session, an act relative to the divestment of pension funds from nuclear weapons. This legislation is House Docket 1914. And then there's also a companion bill in the Senate that's been filed by State Senator Jamie Eldridge. That's Senate Docket 129. And, to really, put my support for our peace agenda in context, I like to go back to when Dr. King outlined those triplets of evil, of racism, militarism, and materialism. And when I think about Mass Peace Action, what I think about is how on those first two triplets, well, by no means we have, reached the finish line and we have so much more work to do. We at least see, on all levels of political discourse, efforts to address racism, efforts to address inequality. But then when it comes to that third triplet of evil, the militarism, all too often it's up to folks like us in this conversation to bring that, to the fore, to bring that into the halls of the legislature, to get that into the media, and to have that conversation. And, likewise, if we bring it up to today, it's widely recognized there are really two existential threats to human existence on this planet. One is climate change, the other is nuclear weapons. Again, when we think about climate change, we have not reached the finish line. We are fighting for every gain we make, but we are actively having that fight. Everybody's talking about that. Joe Biden's talking about that. But again, when it comes to nuclear weapons, has the conversation really reached the level that it needs to? We know it hasn't. We have to do so much more work to elevate this issue of peace, to elevate this issue of nuclear disarmament, and to get it on the same footing as some of the other issues like climate change. And so that's really what this legislation is about. It's a basic divestment bill that would charge the pension funds to go through their portfolios, to look at their holdings, to come up with a report, and then in a responsible and timely fashion, divest those investments. And I think what's so important is to look at the history of divestment in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the tremendous success that we've had. Back in 1982, Representative Mel King was a leader in the effort to have Massachusetts divest from South Africa and the apartheid regime. Massachusetts did that, and that was a critical step in helping to undo that structure of racism of apartheid. Likewise, in the year 1990, Governor Dukakis stood up and said we should divest from tobacco. It actually took us 7 years to do that, so it shows, that the legislative process can be slow and grinding. But by the year 1997, we successfully passed legislation to divest from tobacco, and that helped add to the momentum that has really changed the culture and the thinking around that substance as well. Similarly, these aren't the only examples. In 2007, Massachusetts passed legislation to divest from the Sudanese government relative to their atrocities in Darfur. Back in 1983, Governor Dukakis signed legislation that targeted businesses that supplied military hardware in Northern Ireland. So these are things that we have done. These are things that are possible, and the strategy of divestment, we know, absolutely can work. And it's so important because, we know that when it comes to nuclear weapons, there is only room for one mistake, one either accidental or intentional nuclear discharge or conflict could very well spell the end of all life on Earth. It could certainly spell the end of human existence. And any serious thinker who looks at this situation will tell us this is untenable. We cannot have these nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. We cannot have continued investment in nuclear weapons. We have Draper just down the street from me in Kendall Square. We know they're actively involved in taking these weapons of evil, these weapons of destruction, and making them even more destructive and even more evil. And of course, it's a double whammy from the perspective of morality, because not only is there no justification for these weapons, but we know that they drain the resources that we would need to guarantee housing for all. We know that they consume the resources that we would need to build our transportation infrastructure, to cancel student debt. And so for so many reasons, this is such an important opportunity for us to really move forward in a progressive way. So I'll wrap up there before I get a little too fired up, but it's really awesome to stand with you. And as long as you keep showing up, I'm gonna keep showing up, because we have to put peace on the agenda. It really ought to be up there when people are saying, my agenda is housing justice, racial justice, climate justice, transportation justice, and peace. Let's have peace be a headline central issue, and it truly needs to be. And I think what we're doing here and with this agenda is we're doing this work to center and elevate this cause that absolutely is indispensable. So thanks for having me, and looking forward to supporting all of the bills that are being discussed today.
Well, Mike, thanks so much for laying that out and for revving us all up to get behind that bill. We're all set to go now, I think. But let's instead move to the, thanks again, Mike. Let's move to the far western part of our state, and with Representative Lindsay Sabadosa from the 1st Hampshire District, that includes the great city of Northampton, as well as a bunch of other nice, wonderful, beautiful towns out there: West Hampton, Montgomery, Hatfield. All these towns that we hear about a lot, but we don't actually go visit very often. So Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us this morning to talk to us about the Nuclear Weapons Commission Bill, HD 455. And I think this is something that all of us want to hear a lot about. So thank you for joining us, and let's go right ahead.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction. The only town you forgot was Southampton, which is also beautiful. And you are all welcome to visit as soon as you are vaccinated and our case numbers start to go down. looking forward to seeing you.
Sounds
So
good.
I'm so glad to have gone after Mike because Mike fired everybody up. So now I can take that, scratch that right off of my to-do list, and I'll just dig in quickly about the legislation. So HD 455 is a resolve providing for an investigation and study by a special commission relative to the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I promise that by the time we get this resolve passed, that name is probably going to be shortened, so it will be easier to remember as we work this through the legislature. So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was passed, and it went into effect this January 22nd, which is exciting news, except of course the United States has still not ratified the treaty. So this legislation takes a slightly different approach, and we say, all right, well, the United States has not ratified the treaty. We are not participating, but what can the state of Massachusetts do? What are the components that we on our own could implement so that we as a state, as a Commonwealth, would be in line with that treaty, even if the rest of the United States is not quite ready to do this? So the bill very simply sets up a commission that would go through and figure out what are the components we as a state can do. I see this work very much as a next step, because last session we passed a home rule petition for the city of Northampton where they decided they were no longer going to contract with manufacturers of nuclear weapons, people who maintained, did any sort of work with marketing for nuclear weapons. And so it was a disqualification of bidders. It was a way for the city to try to align itself in small part with the treaty, but it was a small step. This is the next step on that rung. So I think much like Rep. Alaguardo, trying to take an approach of how do we actually get this through, because it's a very common sense piece of legislation. It's a very common sense idea. So I am going to share in the chat three things. So first of all, the link to the legislation itself. There is then a bit.ly, which is the fact sheet about the bill, and I am horrific with proper settings on Google Docs. So if you have a hard time seeing it, let me know. I will share it with you, as well as my cell phone number. We have also created a spreadsheet where we're looking at who we should really target. Again, most of the legislators here today have already co-sponsored the bill. Thank you very much for that. We're going back now and talking to people who co-sponsored last session, because this bill, although slightly changed, is a refile. And then we're going to go to the members of Progressive Caucus, because as Rep. Doherty mentioned earlier, she very kindly had Mass Peace Action come in and do a presentation for us about all of these bills. We're then going to move on and talk to different committee members. It's uncertain if the bill will once again go through Veterans Affairs. That's where it went last session. We had Chair Linda Dean Campbell, who was actually very helpful in giving us some ideas about how to better move forward this session. Of course, we have a new chair, so we are starting over a little bit, but I do think that, again, this is a very common sense piece of legislation. So maybe I'm a little naive in this belief, but I do think this is a thing that we can actually get across the finish line. And I'm very excited to work with everyone on this call to make sure that that happens.
Lindsay, thank you so much for laying that out for us, clarifying that for us, and showing why it's so important for us to all work to get this bill moving. And thanks for joining us this morning and for sponsoring this bill. We have one more presenter, but before we go on, I think we just again should just kind of acknowledge the level of commitment that these legislators that are with us, like Lindsay this morning, are showing in taking up these bills with everything else, with all those other 4,000 bills in the House, that they're willing to focus some of their energy on it. It's very much appreciated. Our next presenter is from the same part of the state, Senator Joe Comerford. Joe is not only the senator from the Hampshire, Franklin, and Worcester district. She is a senator that probably represents more individual towns in Massachusetts than any other person in the legislature. So we won't read through these 25 different towns these beautiful towns out there that she represents. But Joe has also been active out there as an organizer for the American Friends Service Committee and other projects for many, many years. So she is really rooted in this part of the state. And we really appreciate all your work on these bills, Joe, and of course all the work you've done all these years. So welcome, Joe Comerford, Senator.
Hi, Paul. Hi, everyone. It's really good to see you. It feels like I'm back with my AFSC National Priorities Project family, and of course, Peace Action. It's really just wonderful to be here. I'm really grateful to be among great colleagues and you all who have inspired terrific bills. And I'm grateful to be able to support this extraordinarily important slate. You know, because as you know, some of you, I'm a tremendous budget nerd. I went back and looked at National Priorities Project nuclear weapons stats as far back as they have them. I see Edie smile. So in 2018, which is, I think that is the most recent NPP numbers, the US had 21.79, so 2179 billion dedicated to nuclear weapons and their related programs. Massachusetts taxpayers contributed 706.55 million. And so I looked at that in terms of budget priorities that my constituents have, and I have in the form of legislation. So we have a bill filed this session that I'm happy to file called the Cherish Act, which would make up cuts to public higher education. It's been cut by 31% over the last 2 decades or so, and it needs $500 million in investment. It would also fill a gap, a projected gap of special education teachers, now understood to be really critical as we face pretty significant learning loss as a result of the pandemic, and of course, inequitably felt learning loss across race and class lines, rural lines. So 57.8 million for the projected need of 549 special education teachers. And then of course, we just passed this big climate bill and overrode the governor's objection. And this would dedicate wind power for 150,000 homes. And of course, we need to see that kind of public investment if we're going to meet a net zero Commonwealth by 2050. And then some money left over for regional transportation, not enough, but just to round it out, 2.5 million. So the moral and ethical and case for nuclear disarmament is clear. There's also, of course, a fiscal stewardship case that I know many of you have been making for decades and decades. So the legislation I'll talk about is the resolution relative to the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So its temporary docket number is SD 1040, but as others have said, it'll get a bill number soon. So it does a couple things. So it expresses the determination of the Commonwealth to embrace the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So as you know, similar resolutions have been passed by the legislatures of California and Oregon and the Maine State Senate, New Jersey Assembly, and lots of cities and towns in Massachusetts, thanks to your good organizing, including Amherst and Leverett and Wendell, which are from my district. And actually, Paul, I should say, Ann Goby and Adam Hines have more towns than I do. 24 is a lot, but they have more. It calls
Don't believe anything I say, Jim.
No, not at all. It calls on federal leaders to take immediate steps to prevent nuclear war by renouncing the option of a nuclear weapon first strike and as ending the president's sole and unchecked ability to launch a nuclear attack. And it does a number of other things. It's something that I think it is. Oh, Miriam, I put the link there to the bill, to the page on my website where the bill is. And I'll get it for you right now. It's an important statement by the legislature. I'm hoping the Senate can take this. We're putting it in the Senate first. I'm hoping the Senate can take this as just a necessary step to send a message to our federal delegation and federal lawmakers, and really grateful to everyone who is behind this bill, making it happen.
Well, that's great. And Joe is also a sponsor of the Nuclear Commission bill that we heard of earlier, as well as the taxpayer right to know, all filed by Joe in the Senate.
Absolutely, yeah. I just didn't want to take up that time, but yes, and a supporter of this agenda. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joe, and good luck with all that. Good luck with everything that's on your plate. Well, with that, I think we want to thank our senators and representatives who spent the time with us this morning, especially for their work to file these bills. And we look forward, obviously, to working with them. Now it's up to the rest of us to do our part and to do the work that's necessary to get these bills moving. So at this stage, I think we turn this back over to Alec Neely now to pick up the rest of the program. Just to mention that we're very fortunate that Alec has joined Mass Peace Action, and the tremendous amount of work that he's been doing over recent months, keeping us all on track and doing the notes and really keeping track of things and putting this event together today. So Alec, it's all yours.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. Like you said, my name's Alec. I'm a legislative section.
Alec, you froze.
Glad to be here with all of our only at the beginning of what's going to be a very long process through the state legislature. It's saying my connection's unstable. Can everyone still hear me? Can you guys hear me?
We can now, but we didn't before.
You froze for a minute, but you're good at the moment.
All right, sorry about that.
It gets worse, you might have to turn your video off, but try for now.
Yeah, where did I leave off?
I should take it from the top.
All right. So yes, I'm a legislative intern at Massachusetts Peace Action, and all of us here at MAPA are really glad to be here with the rest of the Massachusetts Peace and Justice Network, all the organizations that make up that fantastic group, as well as with all the legislators who are kind enough to be here today and present on their bills. All of those bills, however, are only at the beginning of what's going to be a very long process through the state legislature. Today, we're going to ask you to plan your lobbying efforts to try and help us get co-sponsors for these bills. And the bills are currently being assigned to committees. Once in those committees, we're going to need your help to lobby committee members in favor of these bills. The bills will also change their number once they get into committee, as many of the representatives said. So be aware of that change going forward. And Mass Peace Action, as well as the Massachusetts Peace and Justice Network, will make sure to keep our resources up to date so that you have all the latest information on the bills and the numbers and everything going forward. Later in the summer and the fall, there will be committee hearings on the bills where we'll ask you to attend and make your voices heard in support of all the legislation. And once finally out of committee, the bills are going to need to make it through both chambers before ever reaching the governor's desk. So we're hoping that we can rely on your help throughout the process, and we'll be reaching out over email in the coming months to re-enlist your support. But today is the first big step in that process. We're going to divide you all into small groups with others from your region of the state to plan how best to lobby your local representatives in support of this peace agenda. Your work in lobbying members of the State House and Senate is going to go a long way in educating the legislatures who haven't heard of the bills and in bolstering support for them throughout the legislature. So I'm going to show off a few resources that we've put together. I can share screen. So all of the, when we break up into regional groups, each group is going to have a lead or two, and they will provide you with this volunteer resources spreadsheet. From here, we've divided the state into regions based on how many attendants we had. So we had to merge Central and North Shore together into one, and Southeastern Mass is more or less everything south of Boston, south of the Boston area. But when you click on these links, depending on what region you're in, you're going to get taken to a spreadsheet, and this is going to list all of the relevant information on the representatives and the senators in these regions to help you determine how you're going to go about lobbying. On this sheet, you can see their name, their district, the cities or towns that they are a part of, the party, as well as our internal Massachusetts Peace Action rankings of the candidates, of the legislators, so that you can prioritize lobbying efforts. These are going to be largely additional resources for anyone who wants to take their lobbying efforts further. We're going to ask you to lobby your own representatives primarily, and in addition to that, anyone who wishes to go above and beyond can lobby other representatives from their region, and that is something that you'll be talking about in your groups. You also have what bills each member has co-sponsored. Lindsay Sabadosa, who we just heard from, has very kindly co-sponsored every single one of our 7 Peace and Justice Network bills. And you'll find numbers for those up here corresponding to their bill numbers, as well as all of the senators down here. And again, Joe Comerford has very kindly co-sponsored most of our Peace and Justice bills as well. You also are going to be provided with information on all of the bills, all of our fact sheets, so you can familiarize yourself. Let's pull it up.
It downloads it, but it doesn't show it on the web page.
Is that what it's trying to do?
Yeah,
It's not doing that for me.
for me, every time I
Well,
click that, it would download the bill one more time, the PDF one more time.
there it is. Just took it a couple tries. So here we have a quick overview of all the bills, and if you are inclined to do so, there's extra reading and extra fact sheets on every single one of these bills attached down below. So I believe we're going to break up into these groups. You can also, there's also a list of all the bills on our website that you can use going forward. That'll be constantly updated with new numbers. So keep this link somewhere that you'll remember it, and come back to that throughout lobbying efforts going forward. And we'll be sure to send that out as well. And if you want to send your legislator an email to tell them to co-sponsor these bills, you can click here at the bottom. I believe we're going to divide or break up into those small groups now. Cole, was there any other thing you wanted to add?
A couple